Hi, everybody. We'll just wait a few minutes for people to join and then we'll get started. All right. I see some people are still trickling in, but I think I might just kick things off. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to join us this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. We are very excited to be providing an overview of the recently released VM46 methodology for reducing food loss and waste. I am Liz Ginnessy. I'm the manager of Food and Blue Carbon Innovation at Vera. We might shortly be having Karina Bautista join us, who's a Senior Program Officer of Food System Innovation at Vera. And then also on the line, we have Kai Robertson, who is an independent consultant and also a globally recognized expert on addressing food loss and waste. And then we also have Caldocea Zibicunha, who works as a consultant at Quantist and is also a LCA and sustainability consultant expert. So just in terms of a couple of housekeeping points, we do have a Q&A box enabled on the Zoom. Please feel free to put questions in that box throughout the presentation. You should have the ability to like questions that you would prefer to see seen answered live. So please go ahead and do that. And that gives us an indication of which are the priority questions. We will save some time at the end of this webinar to respond to any questions that come in through the Q&A box. But in the event that we do run out of time to address those questions, you will see my email address and then Karina Bautista's email address as well. And please do feel free to reach out to us with any follow-ups. It's also helpful if you include your name when asking a question in the Q&A box, because then we could potentially reach out to you directly and follow up on your questions. And so in terms of our agenda for today, we will kick things off with an overview of the VCS program. Then we will dive into an overview of the VM46 methodology, and then we will have time at the end for Q&A. And so some background on the Verified Carbon Standard, or VCS program. It essentially is made up of these different components. The VCS program is the world's largest voluntary greenhouse gas program. You will see here that there is an underlying VCS standard, which is a set of underlying rules and requirements that all projects must follow. The VCS contains a set of accounting methodologies, which are essentially contain the procedures to quantify emission reductions and removals for different activity types. So for example, agriculture projects or forestry projects, or now reducing food loss and waste. There is also a system of independent auditing where third-party validation and verification bodies, or VVBs, complete a desk and field audit of a project. And then finally, there is a registry system which tracks data on all registered projects and on VCU issuances as well. And as part of the VCS program, there is a process for developing greenhouse gas accounting methodologies to quantify emission reductions or removals. VM46 followed a Vera-led pathway where Vera released an RFP for the methodology's development. Then those developers were selected. So we have got Kai Robertson and Qantas on the line. They are who we selected to develop this methodology. Then the methodology was drafted. It underwent a public comment period. It was audited by an independent auditor or a VVB. And then finally, it went through an internal final approval by Vera. And so this methodology provides a pathway for projects to be developed under the verified carbon standard. And this slide here provides a very high-level overview of the steps to develop a project. First, project developers must pick a methodology. Then they submit a project description to Vera and request that their project is listed on the Vera registry. All projects must undergo a 30-day public comment period. They must then contract an auditor to do an initial validation of their project design. They then implement project activities, and then an auditor will verify that any emission reductions or removals being claimed by the project are real. And then that project will eventually issue carbon credits after that validation and verification. There's more information on our website if you want any more details on how to develop a VCS project. In terms of what exactly a carbon credit is, a carbon credit represents a reduction or removal of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent in another greenhouse gas like methane. Carbon credits can have benefits for communities, for biodiversity conservation, and for different sustainable development outcomes. And carbon credits are recorded and retired on a registry like the one that Vera manages. And then a good carbon credit should have the attributes that are depicted on this slide. This includes that the emission reductions or removals are real, that they are measurable, and that they are permanent. A carbon credit should be additional, or it should go beyond business as usual. A carbon credit should be independently verified by an auditor. It should be listed and uniquely numbered on a registry, and they should also be conservatively estimated. And so after that little background on the VCS program, and again, there's a lot more information on the program itself on our website, so please do reach out if you have questions, but now we'd like to get into an overview of the methodology itself. So just some quick background on the development of VM46 specifically. An RFP was released back in June of 2021, and then consultants were selected by Vera. The methodology underwent a 45-day public consultation in March and April of 2022. This was longer than the normal 30 days, partially because this is a new activity type for Vera, so we wanted more time to allow for feedback to come in. The methodology underwent VVB assessment in Q3 of 2022. Then it underwent an internal approval process and was released in July of 2023. And I do want to recognize the support of RAP, especially in the initial stages of the methodology's development. For those who are not aware, RAP is a UK-based NGO that focuses on reducing food loss and waste, among other different types of activities to reduce the impacts of climate change. And with that, I will pass it over to Kai.
Thank you, Liz. Hello to everybody joining us, and I'm going to give a few comments related to food loss and waste specifically. So as many of you know, 1/3 of all food produced globally by weight is lost or wasted between farm and fork. That's roughly 1/3, again, of all the food produced in terms of weight. And when we convert that into calories, that looks like the slide you see here, 24% of calories that never get eaten, which equates to more than 1 billion tons of food. And as we have seen across a number of years of looking at this topic now, that clearly has a global impact. Besides the fact that there's an estimated 780 million people facing hunger, and this food could go to feed people if we could find ways to easily distribute it. There's also the global environmental impact, whether we're looking at the water or the fertilizer, the land that was used to grow the food and is now, and quotes wasted, not utilized after all the effort that's gone into growing the food, or when we're talking about GHG emissions, which is the focus of our conversation today. The estimate are that 8 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions are associated with the waste of food. And if food loss and waste were its own economy, that would make it the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. So there's clearly a link between food loss and waste and GHG reductions. If we could be more efficient with the use of food produced, we could really make a dent, because reducing methane emissions from food decomposing in landfills is a really important priority. Food loss and waste is linked to GHG emissions also because of the need to reduce the need to convert land for additional food production as the world population grows. And we also want to see a slowing in the rate of increase in the application of fertilizers. So there's multiple touch points on GHG emissions as it relates to food loss and waste. When we talk about food loss and waste, on the next slide, you'll see that the VCS methodology is based on the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard that was developed by the Food Loss and Waste Protocol. In 2016, the Food Loss and Waste Protocol was an effort led by WRI as Secretariat, along with 6 other organizations, including WRAP, which is a group Liz just mentioned, as well as the UN Environment Program, the FAO, Fusion, WBCSD, and the Consumer Goods Forum. It took 2.5 years to make sure that this standard passed, include all those input from stakeholders. Over 200 people contributed to this standard. It provides common language when we talk about what is food loss and waste potentially. It's not prescriptive on the definition, but it can be used, and it has been used to define the targets related to SDG 12.3 and other targets on saying what are we trying to reduce. And it also provides, in addition to this common language, a standardized way to summarize the data, to summarize your food loss and waste inventory. And there's a lot of practical guidance as well in the document, from quantification methods to other decisions that need to be made as you quantify the amount of food loss and waste. And all of this is available at the Food Loss and Waste Protocol.org website. To sum up where what emissions are covered by the methodology, this next slide is a very simple way to look at what's in scope and what's out of scope for this particular VCS methodology. Well, those of you familiar with carbon footprints probably are familiar with the fact that a significant amount of GHG emissions are embedded in the production of food, but those upstream food production activities are not included at this time in this methodology. So that's what you see on the left. Upstream is not included because there's difficulty in demonstrating that agricultural production or other relevant upstream emissions have been reduced. So this goes back to Liz's point about there needs to be real evidence that reductions have been made for the criteria of a carbon credit. Then in terms of the downstream emissions, that is what is included in this methodology. So that would be what's called the food loss and waste destinations. So downstream emissions avoided due to food being consumed rather than going to an FLW destination, for example, to landfill. Those are the emissions that are covered by this particular methodology. So I've mentioned the destinations. Let me just elaborate on that a little bit in the next slide. So as you can see in this slide, we've got a simple diagram. Some of you might be familiar with this who've been in the food loss and waste space for a while, but we've got the food supply chain at the top. We have potential food loss and waste leaving the human food system. The priority always is to keep food feeding people. Food that is still safe for human consumption should be feeding people. That's the big green arrow. But when food leaves, it can go to a list of 10 possible destinations. So for this particular methodology, it's really focused on avoiding food loss and waste from being generated by keeping food in the human consumption chain. The project specifically must divert food away from one of the following destinations on the slide on the right side here, from anaerobic digestion, composting, controlled combustion or / incineration, landfill, open burning or open dump, and sewer and wastewater. The methodology, very important to understand as well, does not apply to activities that shift food loss and waste from one destination to another. That there's other methodologies that allow for credits from those types of activities. Those are not what this methodology is about. And then one more slide to just emphasize the destinations that are in scope and a consideration call to. We'll talk more about this later in detail, but I want to share here that there are in the methodology default factors. So a proxy, if you don't have a primary data, there's proxies that have been included in the methodology. And these are shown here in order of their size. In the table, that's table 2 in the methodology, the data, the numbers are listed alphabetically, but this shows you that landfill, for instance, without flaring, has the highest default emission factor if that's where the food was going before the intervention. After that, you'll see open dump landfill with flaring are the next 2 bars, and then on down the line, the smaller amounts of GHG emissions for the default factors are what you see for the other destinations, whether it's anaerobic digestion or composting or sewer wastewater. So it's important to think about the magnitude of the destination of the emissions, of course, related to the destinations when you're using this methodology. With that, I'll turn the mic back over to Vera.
Thanks, Kai. Yeah, and so just continuing on with the methodology in terms of eligible project activities, the methodology is broadly applicable to a variety of activities that reduce food loss and waste and keep food in the human consumption chain. These activities can take place at various stages along the food supply chain, like shown on this slide here. And then I wanted to share an example of a potential project activity. So let's suppose that a beer brewer has identified a source of surplus bread that would have been discarded in a landfill. That beer brewer then decides to develop a project and uses the surplus bread to replace 25% of the malted barley in its beer. The brewer then brews the beer using the surplus bread. The beer is consumed, and thus the bread remains within the human food chain and is not wasted or sent to landfill. In terms of project start date, all projects using the food loss and waste methodology are considered to be non-AFOLU projects. That's non-agriculture, forestry, and other land use projects. According to the VCS standard, the project start date for any non-AFOLU project is the date on which the project began generating greenhouse gas emission reductions or removals. And so back to our beer example, it would be the day that the beer brewer began recovering the surplus bread that would have been going to landfill. And again, according to the standard, non-AFOLU projects must complete validation within 2 years of the project start date. Additional time is given for projects that are using new methodologies like VM46. And so projects using a new methodology and completing validation within 2 years of approval of the methodology, they can complete validation within 4 years of their project start date. And then just one other thing to mention, this is a rule that's captured within the standard, but has applicability for the use of this methodology. It is possible to develop grouped projects or projects that have multiple project activity instances. And so, for example, back to this beer and bread example, a brewer could have multiple brewing sites across 2 different geographic areas that are all using surplus bread that would have gone to landfill in one single project. And in that way, you can aggregate different activities to reduce food loss and waste in one single project. And now we want to go over some of the key methodological components, and I will now turn it over to Karina Bautista, who, as I mentioned, is a Senior Program Officer of Food Systems Innovation at Vera. Thanks, Karina.
Thank you, Liz. And yes, I'll be covering the key components of the methodology, starting with project boundary, which is basically the emissions that are included under and accounted under this methodology. And as you can see from the diagram, there are 2 scenarios, 2 sets of emissions, the baseline scenario emissions and the project scenario emissions. The difference between these 2 is what's going to be credited as carbon credits, as VCUs. So the baseline scenario is a business as usual scenario where we are wasting food, and this wasted or lost food is going to a food loss waste destination, a waste facility. The main baseline emissions accounted under the methodology are coming from the treatment of the food discarded at the food loss waste destination. To this, we would add the emissions from transporting the food that has been wasted or lost to that destination. On the other hand, the project scenario, the emissions that are being accounted at the emissions from transporting, processing, packaging, storing, and distributing the recovered food. So to use the bread to beer example, we would be accounting the emissions of the transportation we use in order to pick up the bread from the bakeries or hotels that are donating this bread to the brewing company. The emissions from the machines that are brewing that beer, and the emissions of the glass bottles where the beer is put into, and the card boxes where the beer is put into, so to be distributed to the final consumer. If any beer is wasted, that we call eventual discards, and we would be accounting the emissions from those eventual discards as leakage emissions. So in the next slide, please. We would be just further clarifying what the baseline scenario is. And the baseline scenario is the business as usual scenario where food is not consumed by humans and sent to a food loss waste destination, a waste facility. All projects must demonstrate that food would have exited the human food supply chain in absence of the project activities of what they're implementing. And Kolda is going to dive deeper into this in a moment, but before we do that, I'm going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to spend some time speaking about additionality. Additionality is an often hard to grasp concept of carbon markets, but it's very, very important because it's an essential component of the environmental integrity. It underpins the environmental integrity of carbon markets. And so additionality is basically any emission reduction or removal that would not have occurred without the revenue from carbon finance. So it goes beyond the business as usual. So in order to understand this better, in the context of this methodology, it helps to ask ourselves, would these activities, the activities of the project, so these activities to recover the food and not let it be waste, to recover the bread and turn it into beer, would this have taken place without the financing unlocked by this methodology? So this methodology is unlocking new finance, new pathways of finance. So with the activities that I'm going to implement, would have been able to take place without these new pathways of finance? And many of you may ask why, but why do we have this requirement? And it helps to understand that carbon markets were created as a transitional tool to a sustainable economy. And therefore, their essence is to fund activities that expand climate impact. Plus, they're there to fund activities that are not common practice so that they become common practice in a sustainable economy. So the requirement of additionality ensures that emission reduction and removals that come in the form of carbon credits are in fact in excess of the business as usual. So to illustrate this further, we have this bathtub that you see here. And the bathtub, you have the water represents all the emissions, all the greenhouse gas emissions, all the CO2 that exists in the world in the business as usual. And what's produced comes from the tap, all the emissions that are being produced in the business as usual. So when we unlock new financing through carbon markets to non-common practice activities, we're helping turn off that tap, therefore reducing emissions, or drain the tub, therefore removing those emissions so that the bathtub does not overflow. So non-additional projects neither help to drain or turn off the tap. So this way, each VCU is indicating a net environmental benefit. So in the next slide, I'm gonna tell you the steps that are needed by this methodology to demonstrate additionality. And there are 3 steps that all projects must comply with. The first one is regulatory surplus. This is basically that there has to be no law mandating the activities that are going to be implemented, that we are implementing to recover food. The second step is to identify the barriers that are preventing the implementation of these activities that are recovering food and keeping it in the human food supply chain. There can be investment, institutional, or cultural and social barriers. An example of an investment barrier, for example, is to demonstrate that the cost is much lower to throw away the food than to actually recover it. An example in an institutional barrier is to demonstrate that there are overly strict standards at the grocery store that are making the grocery store waste the food and throw it away when it's perfectly good to still be consumed by humans. a barrier, culture barrier. An example of a culture barrier would be that there's no motivation to change practices at all because it's so much comfortable in a community to throw away the food than to actually recover it. And the final step is to demonstrate that project activities are not common practice. Common practice is defined by the UN's Clean Development Mechanism methodological tools as being greater than 20% adoption rate in the area where we are applicating our implementing our activities. And this is based on the amount of food being recovered relative to the quantity wasted. And finally, we have to do a common practice analysis, which is basically an assessment of similar activities being implemented over the last decade. They have to be similar activities referred to activities of similar scale, implemented in the same region, and at the same relevant, at the same stage of the food supply chain. Evidence has to be independent and publicly available and can be contained in peer-reviewed literature, independent research data, reports, assessments from industry and associations. We only have to make sure that we're using the highest quality available data there is. And so with this, I'll pass it to Koldo so he can dive deeper into the details of quantification.
Right. Thank you, Karina. So I'll get you through an overview of what was the quantification of GHG emission reductions steps and the methodology that we developed. So it starts as they already have introduced. The first step is to quantify the carbon credits issued are the difference between the baseline and the project emissions. So first we need to, or the project developer would need to quantify the emissions related to the baseline or the business as usual, where these food streams of food were being discarded and ending in different food loss and waste destinations. And this has basically two components, which one relates to the transportation of that food loss and waste streams or flows ending up in different destinations, and the part that relates to the emissions happening in the destinations themselves. So due to the treatment of that waste, that organic waste, and this would be sum up for every year of the project, the time frame of the project where it lasts, and it would also comprise all the food loss and waste flows that have been mapped and quantified and are being handled, basically recovered by project activities. So in brief, it consists to do this. Project developers would need to follow this 6-step methodological journey, let's say, starting with the mapping of this the source of the food loss and waste streams, flows, and the destination. So that would be allocating what type of businesses or activities are generating these food loss and waste flows, and where do they end up, and the type, not only the location to calculate the distances, but also what type of destinations they are ending up in, so that afterwards one can apply the correct emission factors. Second step would be to quantify these flows, all the flows that are being handled, recovered, hopefully by these project activities, and they would, and this in this quantification, it also considers, or project developers would need to classify the content of all these flows, which is basically applying a codex from FAO that would help quantify afterwards the dry matter content of these flows, which is the step 3. Basically, once this classification has been done, then one would go to a database that is being it's explained there in the methodology, USD Central Food Database, where depending on the level of the granularity of the data, let's say, of how much details the project developer can have about these recovered food loss and waste flows, then they can assign or estimate different dry matter content or water content, which is the inverse. This is important because we need to correct the default emission factors from the different destinations, as the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions are dependent on this on the water content, as they are proportional basically to the dry matter content of the food loss and waste flows. And with this data and mapping, then one can basically apply the default emission factors and calculate the emissions from the destinations, and then add to those the emissions from transportation, basically applying different according to the modality to how this have been shipped, which is assumed to be a truck collection, and then applying the distance that have been mapped in the first point. So this is the overview of a quick overview of the 6-step calculation or quantification method for the baseline emissions. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first step, as I was saying, it's the mapping of the food loss and waste sources in the pre-project situation. So before the project started with the recovery activities, and this would mean basically identifying, locating, and describing all the sources and destinations of all these flows. This includes obviously determining or estimating the distances between them, which are relevant for calculating the emissions related to the transportation. Next slide, please. Second step, relying always in the food loss and waste standard that Kay presented before. We try to rely as much as possible on existing materials, standards, databases related to food loss and waste that are out there and available, open source. And so this was it was a good timing also that this has been released some few years back. So we relied on it as much as possible to facilitate, also because we, as far as we know, many organizations are using it already to quantify and to do FLW inventories of and to communicate that to the public of their efforts of recovering different food loss and waste streams. So basically, the second step would be, once this mapping of the sources and the destinations has been done, then would be to quantify the actual flows. That means quantifying the mass of these food streams. And the classification, as I said before, that's another important element of the second step, because it's not only important to know how much is going where, but also to know what type of food ingredients or elements are going to the different destinations. Because, as I said, the potential or eventual emissions occurring in different destinations, particularly landfill, is highly dependent on the organic matter, on the dry matter, excuse me, content of the food ending up there. So for that, you would or project developers would need to apply this codex, which is a classification, let's say, standard, or where you, according to what type of food, you can go into different levels of details to apply or to describe the content of the food. And this would help and enable the third step, which is basically once you have characterized these flows, you can, or project developers, again, excuse me, can go to this database, which is quite complete, the completest we could find is the USDA Food Data Central database, which is open source, open access, sorry. And there you can find virtually any type of food, ingredient content or prepared food, searching in either downloading the database itself in different formats, or searching directly on the search bars. And one can extract this information about the water content, which is the inverse of the dry matter content that is used afterwards. In this step, which is in the calculation of the mean dry matter content of the mapped flows, and this would, let's say, conclude the characterization of the food loss and waste flows that is needed to eventually apply the different emission factors to calculate the baseline GHG emissions. So the mean dry matter content is basically, as it says, it's this a statistical weighted average of the different flows, of the water content of the different flows, as described in this formula. I don't think there's much mystery to it. Can go next, maybe. Thanks. And finally, we can apply the formula to calculate the emissions, the baseline emissions that would occur or would have occurred in the food loss and waste destination, which is applying the mass of the food loss and waste flow going to that destination in that year, multiplied by the average or the mean dry matter content of that flow, multiplied by the default emission factor of the relevant destination. So in the case, taking the case back of the Brett's beer example that they put, that would mean, for example, taking the 300 tons of surplus bread that would end up in a landfill, applying the average or the mean dry matter content of this surplus bread, and multiplied by the landfill without flaring emission factor, as shown in table 2 in the methodology. And this would give the first part of the emissions of the baseline emissions. The second part being the ones due to transport, which are described in step 5. Here, the formula is also quite simple. It's basically applying these flows, the mass of the quantified flows by the distance, which gives the ton kilometers, let's say, of these flows, the inventory of the required transportation, multiplied by the emission factor of the transportation mode, which is the one you can see on the screens right now, which is an average diesel truck, and plus multiplying by this emission correction factor to convert it into ton of CO2 equivalents. So once we have applied these to the distance between the source and the destination, you have the second element of the baseline emissions, and then summed up to the previous one, then you would get the total baseline emissions for your project activities. The second part of the quantification would be the calculating the GHG emissions related to the project emissions, to the new project, to the implemented project activities. And here in a similar way, or an analogous way to those baseline emissions, are comprehend of two elements. One is due to transportation, so the collection of the surplus bread that would otherwise have been thrown away and carried by waste collection trucks to a landfill in this case. So what's the extra transportation effort, let's say, in terms of emissions that was needed to recover all this bread and bring it to the brewery? And the second element is related to the processing of this recovered food flows. The processing, the transportation emissions are calculated in the same way as the baseline emissions related to transportation. In this case, the emission factors can be selected from a different from a database that is described in the methodology. So according to what type of transportation mode it has been utilized to carry to collect this bread, one should pick the relevant emission factor and apply to the distance and to recovered mass flows of this bread. This would give again emissions, the project emissions due to transportation in tons of CO2 equivalents. The second element being a bit more generic, the project emissions due to processing of the recovered food, which can have different origins. It can be there can be emissions related to the electricity used to process this food. It can be emissions related to direct combustion of some fossil fuel sources that might be needed to process further, to heat up or sterilize, for example, some food, so that it makes it so that it's possible to be eaten by humans. And then the last part is these other emissions, which cover other possible emissions, for example, necessary additional packaging that can eventually be added to the recovered food to make it to the new end consumers. So in the case of the beer example, it was here, for example, you might need, or the brewer company might need a new machine that slices the bread into small pieces so that it's apt to be brewed together with the malt. It might need additional natural gas to prepare the brewing process, and it might need also some additional packaging, for example, some bags or similar to collect actually the bread and bring it to the brewery. So those two would give the emissions from the project and emissions from the baseline, and then there's one third, let's say, main element, in order to, because we are dealing with food, this might lead to some leakage emissions. So we included those as well, which again are divided in two elements or two components, and these relate to the leakage emissions that may occur from eventual discards, which means maybe part of the bread that was collected, and after a quality check in the brewery, they see that part of it has mold or is not apt to be brewed and might be discarded, and it might need to go eventually to a landfill or might be incinerated. So it would refer to those emissions of the eventual discards as eventual discards of the beer that might not be consumed, which is unlikely in this case, I think. And the second component of the leakage emissions are those of the due to valorization or due to food loss and waste streams that have been recovered that would have ended up in destinations where some sort of valorization occurs. For example, in an anaerobic digester where the produced biogas is used then to to be upgraded to biomethane and then eventually used as an energy carrier, an energy source, or to produce directly energy. This the fact that one is withdrawing this organic matter from these destinations where some sort of material or energy valorization is happening, it might mean a reduction in the secondary product output, for example, biogas energy or or electricity if that was generated in the destination. So those two elements need to be quantified as well and included into the quantification, into the GHG emissions, and reduced from the project or added to the project emissions. Yes, I had already gone through this. So yeah, thanks. Well, maybe I guess it's the turn of Liz now. Are you muted?
Liz?
So we'll have some technical problems.
Hello?
Yeah.
She's coming back.
Yes. Okay, cool.
Back to you.
Sorry. Yes, no, thank you, Caldo, for running us through the quantification section there. Finally, just to kind of close out, the methodology in section 9 contains the different requirements for monitoring and establishing a monitoring plan for each project. I do want to thank all of the stakeholders who provided input during the public comment period for the methodology. That input was invaluable for the methodology's development, and we do appreciate those inputs. And then I did just want to close very briefly mentioning that Vera is developing a Scope 3 program. This program will contain a certification framework for Scope 3 interventions or interventions to reduce a corporate actor's Scope 3 emissions. And Vera is currently considering an adaptation and expansion of the procedures in VM46 to the Scope 3 context. So more to come on that. And with that, that is all we had to present today. And now we are happy to answer some of the questions in the chat. Karina, did you want to dish out some questions?
Yes, we have 2 questions that will be answered first. Liz, I think you can take these. These are from Alexander. Sorry, Alexander, if I'm not saying your last name correctly, Wasserman. So the first question is, will it be possible to consider results retroactively? Didn't understand the 2 years thing. So Liz, could you answer this question, please?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. That comes back to the project start date. And so that start date is the day that a project started generating the GHG emission reductions or removals. And because this is a new methodology, there's a little bit more time before a project must complete validation. However, based on the methodology coming out in July of 2023, basically up until July of 2025, there is a 4-year validation window from a project start date. So there's a little bit extra time to get a project validated within the Vera system, but you would not, for example, be able to go back to 2015 and look at activities that occurred historically and get credits for those. And that is also linked to what Karina described with the additionality requirement, where any activity that is taking place should be additional and go beyond business as usual. And so if those activities already took place, they're not going beyond what is, already taking place and draining that tub as Karina described it. So please feel free to reach out if you still have further questions.
Thank you, Liz. And since we're talking about additionality, Alexander also asked, what about additionality? Does it mean that the only source of revenue that it can have, that a project can have, is the credit generation? And you want to answer this one too, please? Liz? I think we've lost Liz. So due to some technical
Hello?
issues. I will answer this
Hello?
question. Here, there you go, Liz.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I think my
You-
headset is.
can you answer?
Yes. Yes. So I was
Go ahead.
saying that it is permitted to have other sources of revenue for a project. However, there needs to be a very clear demonstration that your activities are facing barriers, going beyond business as usual, and that carbon finance is getting the activity off the ground. But there is no requirement that restricts having some sort of additional source of revenue. However, it could be challenging to demonstrate those barriers if there are other sources of revenue. So just keep that in mind in terms of the evidence that needs to be provided. And I also do want to mention that all projects will be audited by this independent third party, and it will be up to them ultimately to determine whether the demonstration of additionality was appropriate or not based on the methodology and then the VCS standard as well.
Thank you, Liz. I think there's other questions that are going to be answered by I think by Kai and Koldo. I'm going to send it to you. If you don't want to answer, please let me know. But there's one by Ivan Hernandez. It says, "Thus food recovered but unsuitable for human consumption and used for animal food at project scenario count as leakage." Kai, you want to answer this?
I'm not sure I follow the logic here, and unless you're clear on it, Caldo, the food is recovered, it's then spoiled, and then it goes somewhere else.
It's unsuitable for human consumption.
If it's not leaving for
Yeah, it's not suitable for
people,
human
then I guess that would
consumption
be
and use
leakage.
for animal.
Caldo, do you agree? I mean, whatever it's, again, if it's animal food, if feeding pets, it's leakage. It's not going to people.
I would say if the project developer can demonstrate that this food was ending up in, for example, in a landfill, and then now is being used to feed insects or animals that would eventually be consumed by humans, then yes.
Yeah, but I think the example sounds like maybe if you're saying food's recovered in the project scenario, the food is recovered, it then is found to not be suitable for humans and is instead diverted to feed animals. Again, unless you can prove that it's leakage, unless you can prove that going to feed animals is going to, say, feed chickens that are then proven by records to be fed to people. If it's just going to animal feed, like to feed pets or to go to a zoo, that's not staying within the human consumption supply chain. So it depends on what the animal feed is and it ends up being used for.
Thank you, Kai. Yeah, ultimately those animals would have to be consumed by humans so that the waste remains, the food recovered remains on the human's food supply chain. So this next question, Koldo, if you can take it, is from Juan Barasarte. And it says, if a project were to apply option 2 of the methodology, yet the landfill provider does not furnish or disclose data regarding the quantity of captured methane, would it be admissible to utilize registered methane recovery initiatives within the nature under the MDL to approximate the mean methane recovery quantity in the country? Alternatively, could estimations of methane recovery be derived from the data presented in the country's most recent national greenhouse gas emission report?
So if I understood it correctly, is like they would have something more accurate data or emission factor data that is something between option 2 and option 3. So meaning they wouldn't have landfill specific data, but they would have something more specific than the generic emission factor that we have given. That's not covered by the methodology, although I would be tended to say yes, from a scientific point of view, that's more accurate, but it's not, has not been considered by the present version of the methodology.
Thank you, Caldo. If anything, when we're answering these questions, if you still have further questions regarding that same question, please don't hesitate to put it on the chat box, to send it to any of these emails, and we will address it either right now or later on after the webinar is done. We will address all the remaining questions that were not answered here. So thank you so much, Caldo. We have one question that is up on it's voted with one vote up high. So we're gonna read it right now. It refers to food banks. So I think maybe Liz or Kai can take it. Organizations is by Mitch Hagney. Organizations working on food waste diversion like food banks do not always divert the same volume annually. Total volume of diversion is often affected by market forces like price of product, fuel, staff, as well as quantity of philanthropy. How would organizations seeking to apply for credits deal with this when considering common practice and baseline emissions quantification? If they have diverted a certain volume in years past, it seems there is no guarantee they can continue to divert those same volumes in years to come, but credit revenue could ensure it. Liz or Kai?
Yes.
Liz, I think you're ready.
Yeah, can you hear me? Am I? Yes, okay, cool.
Yes.
It's working. Yeah, no, that's a great question in terms of whether food banks that have historically been operating would potentially qualify. I think, first of all, that comes back to the question of project start date and additionality. If a food bank has, for example, been operating for the last decade, then it would be difficult to demonstrate the need for the carbon finance to continue to operate. However, I could see a scenario where a food bank would maybe historically hasn't been able to implement a certain type of activity. And so perhaps that additional finance stream from the carbon credits could help with an expansion of activities. I think something else in terms of just the volatility in the volume throughout the years, that is a complex piece that would need to be worked through. And I think that there's also this complexity around the types of measurements that are being used by various food banks. In terms of whether a food bank that has been operational and went completely bankrupt and then was seeking that finance from carbon credits, again, I think it would be challenging to provide evidence that would be audited by this external third party to demonstrate the additionality of those activities, but it is something that could potentially be viable. And please do feel free to reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions on any of that, because it's something that we've been getting a lot of questions about, and we're happy to kind of work through as much as we can what our rules and requirements say in terms of the additionality demonstration for food banks.
Thank you, Liz. I think we might have, we have about a minute. I don't know if we have more time for one more question. Maybe. Maybe not. We're typing many of the answers. Maybe one more. Yes.
Yeah, let's do one more.
I think one more. Let's do one more. Okay. Let's do this one from Adeline de la Mar. For leakage of biomass in cases where this can be proven, where can this be proven negligible? I'm sure I understand that one. For leakage of biomass, I don't know, Adeline, if you can further clarify, but let's go with two. Rationale for not including deductions in upstream emissions from production and transport. And I think, Kai, do you want to take this one? Why we're not taking upstream emissions? She talked about that.
Yeah, I'm happy
Then
to answer
Liz,
that.
if you want
And
to further
default,
complement.
I can defer to Calder or Liz to add to that, because I mean, in the presentation earlier when we talked about what emissions are covered by this methodology, the food production related emissions are not included because it's difficult to demonstrate that agricultural production or any of the other relevant upstream emissions have been reduced. And again, one of the key criteria underlying a carbon credit is that there has to be real evidence. So the project has to show that it's leads to proven reductions or sequestration of CO2e, and it needs to be measurable with a sufficient degree of confidence. And production related emissions linked directly to product being recovered are difficult to demonstrate all the way back to agricultural production. But Liz, do you want to add anything to that, or Karina, or Vera, or Calder for that matter?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good summary of the rationale behind including downstream emission reductions only in this current version of the methodology. As I mentioned, within the Scope 3 context, we are looking and considering how to take into account those upstream emissions, because we do recognize that's where a lot of the emissions take place. We don't have anything available for that just yet.
Thank you so much. We have remaining questions. Please send them by email, and we will answer the ones remaining in the chat. They're already registered, and we're going to be answering them in the next couple of days. So thank you so much. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else. Thank you so much for joining us. You can write me or Liz at any time with any questions. We can answer questions about the process from to register a project on the BCS standard, or anything that has to do with the methodology. We're there to help you out. Please feel free to reach out. And I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything. It was a pleasure to be here and sharing with you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks Kai and Caldo. We appreciate your contributions.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It was a pleasure. Happy to answer any questions if need that follow-up.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day. Ciao.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.